Hey y'all, it's Ryan. Here is what we did today on day 11, Wednesday. We started with this warm up right here. We're trying to kind of envision like if there was a draft that occurred in modern day, how would it affect your life if most young people left your community? What would be the effects? And we discussed a few things like people would leave jobs. Maybe there would be less violence. Men are the majority perpetrators of violence. Maybe our communities would be healthier. Um, there would be more women around than men, and all the effects that that would have. So we talked about that. That goes on your warm up. The week 3 warm up paper is in the crate if you don't have it. And then the main thing that we did today is we looked at what life was like at home during World War II, and that is on this separate slide deck over here. This is all right here for you in Google Classroom. So, excuse me. The deck is here, the notes are here, and then the video that's in the slide deck is right here. The notes are starting on page 5, so it's the same packet of notes that we started on day 9, Monday. But we just stapled on an extra page. So if you get to here, it looks like this. Day 11, World War II, the home front guided notes. So I'll just talk you through what we discussed in class. We're really looking at this essential question: how did the war affect Americans who were at home? The first step is there is huge mobilization of the military after Pearl Harbor. So the military doubles in a year. Um, we have 60,000 young men enlist just right after Pearl Harbor, and in the week after that. Fighting such a big war just demands a lot of people. So as you can see, these numbers, the Army more than doubles, the Navy doubles, the Marines triple, and it's not just white Americans that are enlisting. It's a diverse group as well. So a million African Americans, and actually 350. Oftentimes women get forgotten, but we're going to discuss this later. 350,000 women enlist. So in the pictures here, you can see. I included, if there's a million pictures I could have included, but I included these to show that the top picture is a segregated unit. At the time, most of the United States was still heavily segregated, and that continued into the military. These are women pilots. We're going to get to later. So there's a big mobilization of people. Also, the War Production Board basically oversees this conversion of private businesses to wartime industries. So in your notes, you fill in these blanks from peacetime to wartime. So, for example, they're helping and guiding factories to convert from building other things to building tanks and planes and weapons. Basically, most factories change over. And the point here is that this is a government intervention. The government is basically going to private businesses saying, you really need to do this. And one of the things we discussed in class is, what if the business said no? Which would totally be in their right to do. If I own a business, it's my money and my risk, and I make the choices. The government can't tell me what to do. But at this time, there was such kind of fervor and patriotism and unification against or for fighting the war, or against Hitler and the Nazis, that there was very little resistance from business owners. And this is an interesting quote from Stalin, basically showing how important this production at home was to winning the war. If you can't build a plane quickly enough, that's one less plane that the military has to use. So very quickly and efficiently um, building and producing equipment was really essential to the war effort. Like we discussed the other day, rationing was also a big change for people at home. I guess we'll start up here. Sorry. The Office of Price Administration basically fixed wages. They kind of put a cap or a maximum on how much people could get paid, and then they also set a max price for goods. And it was in an effort to like keep efficiency, so people weren't like overpaying or overcharging or exploiting, being like exploitative in their pricing, like taking advantage of people. Also, the rationing and conservation looks like this. Basically, you would get a booklet, or like, think of it as like a coupon booklet or like a card. And to buy a product, you needed that card. So, for example, this is a gasoline ration card that would allow you a certain amount of gasoline per week based on your needs. Um, so, if you were a family of four with one car, you might get a certain amount. But if you were, say, a farmer and you had equipment to run, or you had a business that had a fleet of vehicles, you might get more, and the government would limit that for you. Also, same thing with food. You would get these coupons, and you couldn't buy the thing without the coupon. So you couldn't buy butter or milk or coffee or sugar without the coupon, and you could only buy so much. The example we used is for the typical person or family, I believe it was 2 ounces of butter a week. So that's a quarter of one stick of butter per week. So like imagine getting one stick of butter a month. Like depending on how much you cook with that, um, it would change your habits. Also, we reduced the national speed limit in an effort to save gasoline. The government kind of had these things, Meatless Monday, Wheatless Tuesday, etc., to try to get people to consume less of those products. And then, like we talked about yesterday, and looking at the propaganda, the government encouraged normal people to plant gardens so that they could eat their own food from their land and not buy food from the grocery store. Also, the Office of War Information put out these, all the posters we've seen, the Uncle Sam, the videos, all this stuff. The point here is that their main message is this: remember why we're fighting this war. It's a war over democracy versus dictatorships, right? We're fighting these totalitarian leaders, and it's about freedom, it's about democracy. So this is a really interesting example of like connecting this idea of liberty across more than a century, from the Revolution to World War II. Also, this is a really cool part: women at war. So, like we said, over a third of a million women served in the military in many different units. So, this is one, the Women's Army Corps, lots of non combat roles. And here's some more posters that you can see trying to encourage enlistment. Also, there was like an Army Corps or a Nurse Corps, women Air Force service pilots, really cool. So they would fly like cargo shipments. Um, and here are some more posters for you to see. It's a really significant effort, like a really significant contribution to the military. One detail down here is they did not, they weren't treated equal. So they didn't get the same benefits after the war, unfortunately. Also at home, all these men are leaving jobs, a lot of factory jobs that become essential to the war. So women fill 200,000 of these jobs. This really iconic poster of Rosie the Riveter is actually like derived from this painting of a real riveter. Um, and we could talk for a long time about this. But basically, she kind of becomes this like icon of like a strong working American woman. Um, these are some real pictures of women working. Riveting is like, if you can see here, it's like when you're building an airplane or a ship or anything, and you need to overlap two pieces of metal. They use these things called rivets to kind of secure them, and we're building a lot of ships and planes and tanks that need rivets. So that's why they were so important. Another group that was experiencing discrimination during the war was people of color, and African Americans in particular. So here's a statistic that I think tells a really clear story. Of 100,000 workers in the aircraft industry, only 240 were African American. So African Americans are being blocked from gaining entry to these jobs. But as we saw on the first slide, we have 1 million Black soldiers fighting for our freedom and our liberty. So there's this very clear discontinuity, this incongruency, this hypocrisy there, where yes, you can fight for liberty and freedom, but when you come home, you're not going to have liberty and freedom. You're going to be discriminated against. So a lot of black leaders launched this double V campaign, and this was kind of their slogan: victory against fascism abroad and victory against discrimination at home. So it's kind of this dual front battle of not only are we fighting the war effort and trying to bring down fascism, which is a violent racist ideology, we also are trying to do that at home. So there's a bit of irony in there. There's a bit of hypocrisy in that. And you can see here is their logo, double V victory, at home and abroad. There's a few conferences. The NAACP, which is a civil rights organization, has these conferences where they're trying to connect Jim Crow or segregation laws with these fascist governments like the Nazis and imperialism, imperialist Japan. So they're trying to make a connection between the evils that we're fighting abroad are not that different than the evils people of color are experiencing in our country. And this final detail, FDR, the president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he basically tells the Double V campaign, "Hey, wait, we can't focus on the war. We're focusing on the war right now. We can't quite focus on this yet," which is, a bit of an excuse. This is another awesome Dr. Seuss cartoon that shows Uncle Sam, tapping this guy on the shoulder. The piano player represents war industry. And he's basically saying, "Hey, listen, Maestro, if you want to get real harmony, use the black and the white. Use the black keys as well as the white." And the point that they're trying to make is that in in wartime, when production urgency is very high, you can't discriminate, right? We can't have these black keys have cobwebs on. We can't continue to discriminate against people of color when we need planes and ships produced. So this is like really strong commentary on kind of forcing the United States to face itself in the mirror when it comes to its like discrimination. As a result, the president, FDR, passed this executive order that basically said, in defense industry and government funded jobs, you cannot discriminate. So like this is another pretty interesting poster showing like ending discrimination will help us win this war. Also, a lot of leaders were encouraging Black Americans to join groups like the NAACP, like I mentioned, like a civil rights organization, and CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, with the ultimate goal to fight segregation. Another thing is that there's a huge labor shortage in rural areas on farms. This is a time where most farms are run by normal people and they're not these big factories. So you can imagine a farm with like, I don't know, imagine a father and his two sons are working a farm. And if those two sons leave to go to war, that cut that farm's labor source by 2/3 or 67%. So the United States partners with the United States to bring laborers in from Mexico, and this proves essential to producing enough food for Americans and for the war effort. So here's another really cool poster. We're all Americans, fight for victory. It's cool. This is another kind of side story that I think is really tells a sad but important story of racism and discrimination at the time. So in LA, it was very like fashionable for young guys to wear these things called zoot suits. I know a lot of people looked into this in Molly's class. And there's this incident that happens where um, in the summer of 93, there's a bunch of off-duty sailors hanging out in LA, and something happens to where they start attacking these Mexican and Mexican American zoot suiters, these like kids, these teenagers, basically like kind of dressed up in this iconic way. And the outcome is really embarrassing. But the police side with the sailors, who are the attackers, instead of the victims. So they basically largely ignore the sailors, who are the perpetrators and the attackers, and they arrest the victims. So just like another story to, excuse me. Excuse me. So just another story to kind of highlight the inequities in our country. So another thing that's going on, we have millions of guys over fighting, and they're away from their families, their wives, their girlfriends, their partners, and they need some entertainment. So basically, the government started this organization called the USO to basically boost morale and to entertain and provide music and dancing for soldiers. So basically, they hired a bunch of celebrities and people to go perform, singers, dancers, to people to give speeches. And I told this to class, but one of my great aunt, she was a USO dancer, so she went over and she actually met her husband there. They got married. And the whole point of this was to kind of give soldiers a break, really, to let people cut loose and have some fun. Another thing that was going on at home is that following Pearl Harbor, there was this major fear that any Japanese or Japanese American people living in America might be a danger. So the government decided to basically round up thousands of people and put them in what we called internment camps, or which is kind of a more pleasant word than a prison camp, which is kind of more what they were. The camps were armed and they were basically surrounded with barbed wire, and generally they were in the middle of nowhere. There's a video here that goes into a little more depth about the whole arc of the story that you could watch, or it's also linked on Classroom. And basically, if I could summarize it, it was voluntary, technically, but they basically forced people into these camps. People had sometimes less than a week to sell their belongings, their businesses, their homes. And for 3 years, they lived in these conditions that were basic, like it was they were in prison for 3 years for committing no crime. This guy, Fred Korematsu, sued the United States over it. And he said, hey, it's unconstitutional to hold me for not committing a crime. I have a right. I have a right to a trial, and if I haven't committed a crime, I can't be locked up. So he brings this case before the Supreme Court in 1944, so pretty quickly. And in one of the ugly Supreme Court rulings, the Supreme Court actually upheld or sides with the law and says, in times of war, security is more important than your civil rights, your civilian rights. So they actually said these internment camps were legal, which is wild. Nothing like this would ever happen today. But I think this is a really important chapter in history to talk about. It gets brushed over quite frequently, but it's really easy for us to point fingers at how terrible the Holocaust was and how evil that was. But what we did was not that different. Now, they weren't extermination camps. No one was getting killed intentionally, but people were being held against their will for years. In 1988, the government formally apologized and offered reparations to any living internees. They offered $20,000, which is, kind of a joke in class. I had people guess how much, what is 3 years of your life worth? People said $1 million, $500,000, $250,000. So this $20,000 figure is pretty embarrassing, but I think it was, a gesture. Like, you can never financially make it right, something like that. But that is what happened under President Reagan in 1988. So that rounds out our notes, and I believe that's the end. Yep, Korematsu versus the United States. The very last thing we did is we had some vocab. So for vocab, this unit, instead of telling you the 4 words, you can just choose whichever 4 you want. So here's a list that I thought would be relevant. If you have a word that something you're really interested in doing, and it's not on this list, that's totally fine to do something different. The paper for this looks like, let me this World War II vocab. Basically what I did is I just left a blank where the word goes. So you just fill in whichever word you want to go here for the Frayer model. And like always, the definition, the dictionary, and in your own words. Use the word in a sentence to show me and Grace that you really know how to use it. Some image to help you remember it. Could be as simple as a sketch, a symbol, and then some examples of what that word looks like, sounds like. Some concrete examples of that word. So I hope this really helps, guys. I'll be gone Thursday and Friday, so you'll be with Grace and you'll be with Shirley, and I'll see you on Monday.